Evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the ACF's report, Africa Transitions and Future Opportunities 2025 to 2030. Thank you for taking the time to join us. We know how busy this period is for everyone, and we truly appreciate your engagement. So today's session focuses on the outcomes of the scenarios process that we as ACF have run over the past months. But before we dive into those outcomes, we wanted to briefly explain why this work emerged and how the process has unfolded, because that context is important for understanding both the report itself and today's discussion. So at the beginning of the year, we at ACF, like many across the continent, were trying to make sense of the profound shifts taking place in geopolitics and finance and technology, and trying to understand what this might mean for Africa's climate and development trajectory. And while we knew we would never have a crystal ball, we also recognized that we urgently needed much better tools to allow us to think more systematically about how these global dynamics could shape Africa's future. And this is really where the scenarios process was born. But what we also recognized was that many of our partners were grappling with exactly the same questions and uncertainties. So from the outset, we've designed a process that could serve a much broader community, not just the ACF, bringing partners directly into the scenarios workshop and producing a final report that would be accessible and hopefully useful even to those who are not part of the process itself. And today's launch is a culmination of that work and reflects our commitment as ACF to make the insights that came out of this work available to everyone. Just a quick note on the process itself. So, at the heart of this work was a very simple but urgent question, which is how is Africa positioned in a rapidly changing world? And what must the continent do now to secure its place in the global transitions that are already underway? And to explore this, we spent the past 4 months in 6 scenarios workshops with over 100 experts from across the continent and beyond. And together we examined how Africa's future could unfold under very different conditions, whether the world becomes more cooperative or more fragmented, whether capital flows strengthen or weaken, whether governance systems improve or deteriorate, or whether economies continue on an extractive path or shift towards more transformative value-adding models. And the goal wasn't to guess which future will happen. Instead, we were asking ourselves two core questions, which is what opportunities hold for the continent across all possible futures, both good and bad, and what are the no regrets actions that Africa can take right now. And to answer these, we framed the conversations around three main themes. The first was how global shifts over the next 5 years might shape Africa's transition. The second was how Africa's own political and governance dynamics could influence progress. And the third was what does this all mean for philanthropy and how can funders best support Africa in this evolving context. And across the entire process, five priorities kept on coming up again and again, no matter which future we imagined. And these are the priorities that are reflected in the report, and and they're the ones that we'll be diving into in more detail today. But in a nutshell, the message from the engagements was clear, and that's that if Africa is to prosper and achieve its climate and development goals, it will need stronger regional cooperation, bolder green industrialization, deeper localization, greater mobilization of domestic capital, and stronger capacitated institutions. Before we move to our speakers, we wanted to express our deep gratitude to those who have made this work possible, to Russ Strategic, Tim Larson, Dana Stefan, and Janelle Roberts for their incredible support in helping to shape and facilitate the scenarios process, to Professor David Luke, whose guidance and insights have been invaluable throughout, to the Climate Works Foundation for their partnership and support, and to the exceptional ACF team, Zara Jarraj, Nazira Davids, Kelly Easton, Lucas Ngine, Kerry Francis, Charlene Nell, whose commitment and expertise really helped to bring this work to life. And of course, we want to thank the experts who contributed their time, their analysis, and their candor throughout this process. So we have a relatively large group with us today and quite a full agenda. So we encourage you to share your comments and questions in the chat. And we in particular encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to do our best to address them during plenary or directly in the chat. But if we don't manage to get to them, we're very keen to keep this conversation going. So please do reach out to us after the session. We'll also be putting the link we might already have, the link to the report in the chat shortly, as well as the agenda with the speakers' bios. So please keep a lookout for that. And please also note that the session is being recorded and we will be updating it to the YouTube channel. With that, I'd now like to hand over to Salim Fakir, the Executive Director of the African Climate Foundation, who's going to situate this work within the broader arc of Africa's climate and development journey and what it means for how we all act in the years ahead. Salim, over to you.
Thank you, Ellen, and also just to congratulate you and the team for getting us here. I know it's been quite intense, and there are two parts to this, as you noted. The one is to inform ACF and its own positioning in the next 5 years as we are going through a new strategy process. And secondly, we very quickly realized the value of this work for the general community that we are working with across not only Africa, but the rest of the world. I'm not going to be try to be too long, but I thought I would just share some perspectives on this particular scenario exercise. The first is that in the past we would consult astrologists to figure out how to read what's going on in the world. I think we have more scientific methods these days, but I'm also reminded of the work of social scientist Philip Tetlock and his Good Judgment Project. And he wrote a book, a famous book called about experts and political judgment. How good is it? And I think he came to the conclusion after 20,000 sort of interviews and surveys, the predictions of most people, including experts, make about the future outcomes are not usually significant better than chance. And I hope that this work of ours is not going to end up in the same way, but I do think there's a lot of merit in it, being mindful of the advice that Philip Tetlock has made. But why it's important for our work as an African Climate Foundation, firstly, when we consider climate work, we are not only looking at it from the lens of climate, but trying to situate climate work in the bigger picture of global affairs. And I think that's very important for us to understand because we have a whole set of issues that we are tackling on the continent that is influenced not only on trends and developments on the continent, but also outside of the continent. And so it's understanding Africa in the world as much as the world and Africa and its relationship. So the scenarios help us to consider and reconsider climate action and solutions in a changing world. That changing world is presenting to us what Clem Sunter, a famous scenario expert in South Africa, did many years ago, is a set of flags. Hopefully, they are not false flags, but events and trends that give us a sense of the direction the world is going and what may be some of the responses that we may take, both as ACF, as actors on the continent, and perhaps the continent as a whole. And I will come to the question of African agency just now. What I like about the scenarios is that it tries to look at our work and the exercise that was undertaken by at least 3, 4 sets of work with various experts and internally within ACF is to bring an element of realism in the scenarios. What does it look like in the next 5 to 10 years? Not as predictions, but as I said, a set of trends and issues that are emerging and trying to give meaning to them because the world is changing, and I think well, we know the world is changing. The question is really, and this is the issue that we grapple with in our work, is the range of uncertainty that we may be facing, the unpredictability of that level of uncertainty. Now, uncertainty is something that we all have to grapple with, whether in our individual life, organization, or as the African continent as a whole, in terms of its own engagements. I think more pertinently for ACF, it's more around the role of philanthropies as a collective in this changing world. So the entire ability of the African Climate Foundation to increase investment flows cannot escape an understanding of how the world is changing. While we may not control what we can only control what we can do. We have no control over the agency of others. Despite this should not mean that Africans cannot exercise agency in the new and unfolding context. There's not a point about being exasperated and feeling hopeless or having the inability to actually engage and to uh, muster a collective approach in dealing with this. If anything, change is the provident of new forms of agency. That's the exciting part of what the scenarios tells us. So the questions I think, the panel and others are probably seeking to understand or answer is what does it mean from the vantage of ACF on one hand, all these changes and these trends, and from the vantage of our stakeholders that we work with, and what does geopolitical rivalry mean for those who are in the agency of competing with each other, um, and therefore having an impact on Africa? And what behaviors should we understand that they will exhibit? I'm seeing some of that already in the news. And is there, and in their behavior, there is both a risk and opportunity. So I think those are sort of my sort of questions for us. It's a ongoing project that won't only end at this webinar, but will continue beyond this webinar. And hopefully the report will catalyze many others to contribute to that discussion. But really, the question for us is the risk and opportunity that the prevailing trends and undercurrents are busy exhibiting that we need to understand and use our agency to deal with the risk, but also to take up the opportunities. Thanks.
Thank you, Salim, for that very important framing. We now want to hand over to the chair of our board, whose CV is way too long for us to read, and I don't think he needs an introduction. Prof. Carlos Lopez, over to you for the keynote address.
Thank you. I'm really very pleased to be participating in this exercise, given the moment that we are going to face. We are already facing to a large extent, but it's going to be even more complex moving ahead. And also because of the fundamental opportunities that Africa can have in the current configuration of the world if we play our cards well. We meet at a moment when climate debate is no longer happening around us. I think it is happening to us. And Africa knows this very well. And Africa, whether it likes it or not, is sitting at the epicenter of the world's most consequential transitions that are already occurring. Sometimes I joke that Africa is the only region expected to leapfrog while someone keeps moving the landing spot. And behind this humor, the real question is, how do we plan when the ground is shifting faster than our institutions were designed to adapt. A good example that I like to mention is the Continental Free Trade Area. If you look into the timeline of building a similar uh, frame and configuration, including the European Union, you'll realize that we are pretty good in terms of our timeline. The different steps that were supposed to take place in the period since the approval of the Continental Free Trade Area are actually pretty fast. But the problem is that we are no longer in the same calendar. And there is an acceleration, and what makes it a bit slow in relation to the needs is precisely because we are not constructing this at the same time as others did. So everything is accelerating. I remember in the run-up to COP30, I've been arguing that Africa must stop negotiating as if the world owes us something for being victims of climate change. I think that narrative has reached its limits. The world is moving into a new climate economy, including the US, that seems to not like the Paris Agreement, of course, but they are of course, fighting for critical minerals and other aspects of the climate economy. One where the winners are not those who complain the loudest, but those who organize the smartest. And Africa actually has a chance to be in the winner's side, has a chance to take advantage of this new configuration if, and it's a big if, we recognize that we are not heading into a transition. We are already in the middle of it. The climate clock is not ticking. It has already struck. So the energy transition is creating a new geopolitical map. And Africa sits on these minerals that redraw that map. But minerals do not guarantee transformation anymore, and having a dictionary guarantees that you will be able to be a writer or write a novel. We must move beyond extraction and insist on value creation. Everybody knows that by now. Exactly the point that we have been making in different writings of the Africa Climate Foundation, but others have done as well. So the area of shipping raw materials and importing finished ambitions has to end. And if COP30 is going to mean anything for Africa, it has to be the COP where the continent stopped auditioning for sympathy and start negotiating for power. You could see the dynamics changing. And even some countries in Africa wanted to lead in different areas. Case in point, Ethiopia. Which brings me to the scenario work that we are going to discuss today. I appreciate in this process is that it does not assume a benevolent world. Salim just said it. It assumes a messy one, precisely the world that we are in. Global governance fragmentation, check. Volatile capital, check. Partners treating Africa like the world's strategic supermarket, double check. And this is not pessimism. It's just refusing to decorate the room before checking whether the roof is leaking. So across scenarios, 5 imperatives stand out. And they align perfectly with what I have been pushing in various processes I'm involved with, the G20, FFD4, and various COPs. First, the issue of integration. You have all heard, and I've said it as well too many times. We have 54 fragmented market negotiating separately with 55 or 53 or 52 people trying to blow up a candle one at a time. You either blow together or it doesn't happen. So the Continental Free Trade Area is not a trade instrument. People have to understand that. It's more than that. It is a climate instrument. It is a development instrument. It is a political instrument. It is our flagship. It is also our agenda. Without scale, we'll always be price takers, and someone else is going to be responsible for our own climate transition that is going to put us way down. So linked to that is the issue of green industrialization. Let's say the second preoccupation. I've spent half the year warning that Africa risks becoming the battery pack of the world without ever owning the charger. If we do not secure processing, refining, manufacturing capacity, we'll once again watch the value fly offshore while we keep the environmental and political risks at home. So we are kind of having a discussion when we talk about green industrialization as if it was something that resembles the current value chains. It does not. It's quite different. The premises of productivity and the competitiveness that were the regulators of the old global value chains don't apply here. That's why, you have discussions like CBAM, carbon market, security, and so on. So these are other elements than just economic pure elements. So green industrialization, if it is well understood, is our insurance policy against repeating history. But for that, we need to really understand deeper that we are dealing with a different animal. Then the third one is localization. And here I can speak plainly. External solutions imposed on Africa last about as long as the rain. If projects do not sit in local institutions, if we create some islands of perfect sense, but isolated from the rest of the geopolitical context and also the local context, and lack local legitimacy, lack local priorities, they just evaporate. They don't scale up. Localization at the end of the day is about governance. It's about, putting in place the governance that really matters. There is also a debate about governance that sometimes is a bit of a decorative and caricature discussion. Fourth is the issue of domestic capital mobilization. I think we cannot finance a green future through begging bond. That model, honestly, has variations, but the latest one being, hybrids. But at the end of the day, it's just, translating into commercial terms what before was promised as concessional. And it's also about this game of leveraging. Everybody's putting a bit of money and saying leveraging. And so everybody's leveraging each other's money, but at the end of the day, it's the same money. Africa has a lot of domestic savings. Depending on how you calculate it, between sovereign funds, pension funds, you are in excess of 1.3 trillion. But it's locked. We can't use it because of regulation, because of the way we deal with risk and risk perceptions, and also because there is an absence of appropriate investment vehicle. So I myself am quite involved right now with a number of financial institutions in the continent to really create a different model that is going to be able to tap into our own savings. So climate action financed from within is not just possible. For me, it's unavoidable. And it is the premise of us being able to mobilize money elsewhere. China for a long time was one of the number one destinations of FDI, of course, because also they use their savings to propel the conditions that allow this attractiveness to settle in. So fifth is the issue of institutions. I think minerals, youth, sun, wind, all of these things make a lot of headlines. It's all, the usual thing. We are very rich because we have natural resources. Now we add a bit of human capital, youthness, and so on. And of course, we tend to just park this idea without, actually knowing exactly what it means to transform all this into something that is really transformative. And I think institutions make history. Without institutional capability, all these elegant scenarios remain PowerPoint slides, search for, pilots and stuff like that. So we ought to avoid that, obviously. As for partners, including philanthropy, I think we have to put it simply. The era of feel-good funding is no longer available. Philanthropy has to matter in this decade, and for that it must take political risks. I think it has to support more African analysis. It has to back more African coalitions. It has to build institutional muscle that we need to stand upright in these times, and to allow us to do something that was not associated with something good, but now it's actually the best position of all, sitting on the fence. We should sit on the fence. And yes, sometimes this means that philanthropy will be asked to fund things that are not sexy, like regulation, like standards, taxonomy, industrial planning, integration mechanisms, and stuff like that. But without the boring things, I think the ambition of the rest will not materialize. So let me end with a metaphor. People often say Africa is at a tipping point, but tipping points are things you fall into by accident. Africa doesn't need a tipping point. It needs a turning point. And turning points are chosen, not stumbled upon. The beauty of scenario planning, Salim, is that it forces us to rehearse the future before it arrives. Maybe it will not happen, but you rehearse. And the beauty of moments like, what we just lived through, this COP30, is that they allow Africa to stop reacting to global agendas and start asserting its own agenda. And looking across the scenarios and the work that has been done and the imperatives I just mentioned, they matter because they go to the heart of Africa's governance, the heart of our, sort of political economy. The first is the need to deepen African cooperation, regional integration, in a world that increasingly organized around economic blocks. Supply chains are becoming strategic. No African country can secure favorable outcomes on its own. And you know that when the continent acts collectively through its various institutions, it has more influence. And when it acts in fragments, others define the rules. So we already know that. The second imperative related to green industrialization and value addition is that we really have to put energy transition at the center of it. And if Africa does not industrialize around this resource base and in energy potential, it will once again take the risks while others just smile. On localization, embedding the way reforms, investments are designed. Experience shows that externally imposed models often fail to stick. So how do we make governance legitimacy comes from solutions that are rooted in the internal, in the local? On the fourth, the imperative is mobilizing domestic capital, of course. But we have to understand that this is not only about closing financing gaps. It is about strengthening sovereignty. It's about reducing vulnerability. It's about building confidence. So it's about agency, and Africans, have to, have a mindset change, be able to exercise their agency in a different way. And finally, on the institutional capacity, well, we do have a lot of knowledge about planning, coordination, implementation, but we are sort of boxing this log frame mentality. We think that everything has to be more or less the way we design projects, the way we govern projects, and the way we account for projects. And I think the quality of Africa's future will be determined by institutions that are capable of not necessarily departing from that, but are capable of being much more adjusted to the realities that are local and not just this thing that, pleases a lot of think tanks and a lot of the development industry. So these are not isolated actions, and I think we have to reinforce them in different ways. And I think a brief word on partners is basically to tell them that the starting point must be African priorities first. philanthropy in particular has an opportunity to support this independence. They can help us with foresight. They can help us with analysis. They can help us with investment. Uh, they can help us, basically deal with the partnerships in a different way. And that is going to make them relevant, and it's going to make us more relevant. Because I think in this decade, this African agency is like political literacy to deal with what we have in front of us. It's a decade that is not only going to define, to a certain extent, Africa's destiny. It's a decade that actually is going to make some of the future possible or not because of the way we direct our energy and our investments. So I thank you, and I look forward pushing this discussion even more with all of you. I may not be able to stay beyond the hour, but this is a very exciting exercise, and I really want to thank all that have invested on it.
Amazing, Prof. Thank you so much for that. I think really powerful words and very candid remarks, and you've set moving into. We're really thrilled about the group that we have with us today. Each of the panelists has been deeply involved in the entire scenario series, and they're some of Africa's leading thinkers and practitioners. Their expertise is extensive, and like Prof's, far too long for me to summarize here without taking up the entire session. So we've dropped the bios in the agenda, which, as I mentioned earlier, are on the chat. And with that, let's get straight into the conversation. So to begin with, I want to start with a question that sits at the heart of continental transition, which is cooperation. And David, to you, Africa's ability to navigate global uncertainties hinges on its collective strength. From your perspective, what's the most immediate opportunity for African countries to strengthen regional cooperation in a way that can meaningfully enhance the continent's influence in global trade and finance, in climate and development?
Thank you, Ellen, and greetings to everyone, fellow panelists, as well as all that are on this webinar. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. So building upon what we've just heard from Professor Lopez, let me also begin by underscoring something that came through very strongly in scenario discussions. And that is that Africa's ability to shape its own climate and development future depends profoundly on how effectively we work together as a continent. Across countries, regions, we see the same pattern. When African countries coordinate their positions, whether in trade, in climate negotiations, or energy policy, leverage increases. And you just heard Professor Lopez as well on this. We saw this, for example, with Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire working together to raise cocoa prices. That kind of collective action is a reminder of what is possible when we move with a shared stance that centers African priorities. So for African cooperation, this is the strategic pathway to ensure that global rules on trade, on climate, finance, technology reflect our realities. When we're divided, others set the terms of engagement. When we're united, we become authors of the systems we operate in. So regional integration through the African Union, the Regional Economic Communities, or RECs, the African Continental Free Trade Area, all of this is essential. Integration, as already has been said, is how we build cross-border infrastructure, how we create regional value chains that allow industries to scale, how we advance food security and boost agricultural productivity, and how we diversify our partnerships, including, of course, through South-South cooperation. But we also need to keep a realistic lens. No single country, not even the leading economies in Africa, can drive this alone. Africa's transformation depends on coordinated policies, shared investments, and firm commitments to implementation. So we have to recognize that Africa is still operating below its integration potential. If you take intra-African trade, this is still only about 15%. Manufacturing remains constrained by gaps in connectivity, energy, power supply, logistics, infrastructure. So, fully realizing the promise of regional integration means addressing these structural barriers head on. Let me conclude with 5 key points that I think are important here. Cooperation allows us, firstly, to speak with one voice in global fora, increasing Africa's bargaining power in areas like carbon markets, climate finance, intellectual property, trade rules. Secondly, cooperation enables us to pool resources for large-scale investment. As we've been hearing, there is domestic savings on the continent. But especially to prioritize areas and sectors like energy, transport corridors, digital infrastructure, climate resilient systems. This is all what will crowd in foreign investment, as Professor Lopez was saying. Thirdly, build regional manufacturing and processing hubs, reducing dependence on raw commodity exports. Fourthly, expanding inter-African trade, which remains too low relative to our market potential. And here we have seen that all the modeling, whether it's by the World Bank, IMF, UNCTAD, UN Economic Commission for Africa, all the modeling is pointing to the tremendous impact that full AFCFTA implementation could have. And then finally, use Africa's own savings, as we've heard. But also, let's not forget financial cooperation, which we're seeing in initiatives like the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System that is now linking 16 central banks that can help foreign exchange costs, speed up cross-border transactions, and also, of course, one could mention here that efforts like the African Single Electricity Market can reduce the cost of power and improve reliability, both of which are essential for competitiveness and industrial growth. So let me end with this point. The core message that I want to emphasize here is that Africa's ability to shape global outcomes and secure a just transition for the continent will depend on how effectively we act together. Cooperation isn't just aspirational, it is a strategic opportunity for the next decade. So let me stop here, Ellen, and over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. I want to shift us now to the economic structures that will underpin Africa's place in the global transition and especially industrialization. Rob, as global demand for green technologies and minerals grow, what's the most important shift that Africa needs to make to move us from just exporting raw materials to actually building competitive green industries?
So let me start. I want to build on what's been said by the previous two speakers, because I think that what they said is an important background to what I want to say. So I think I would sort of sum up by saying that I think that the global circumstances that we find ourselves in have made imperative what was for a long time recognized as desirable. And that desirable thing, which has been identified going right back to the first generation of African leaders, is to break out of the apron strings of dependence on raw materials, to move our value chains, and to capture more of the value chains in our own economies. And I think that what David has just highlighted, and Carlos did as well, is that this is only going to be realized to its full extent if we operate collectively as a continent. And I think that the real point is that the African Continental Free Trade Area as a bloc is equivalent to the world's eighth largest economy, has a population which is on a par with those of the large industrializing countries of Asia. And it provides just so much more of an opportunity for deeper as well as more inclusive industrialization than any attempts that are made within our own national economy. So I think that the issue is that the African Continental Free Trade Area needs to be recognized as this potential to support industrialization. And that means in some respects, recognizing that the work that's already been done to set up a free trade area, which was a trade integration agenda, has to give way now to a developmental integration agenda, one which is now talking about the fact that if we want to enhance intra-regional trade up to the levels of ASEAN or some other parts of the world, what we're going to have to do is address the fundamental structural issues, which are that we have um, in underdeveloped production structures and inadequate infrastructure, and that these are often bigger barriers to increasing intra-regional trade than actually are any kind of other regulations or tariff issues that you could think of. So I think it's a question of moving now to build regional value chains that are going to support deeper as well as more inclusive industrialization. Now, of course, this is taking place in the context of a transition to low carbon economy. And I think that there's quite a bit of work that's been done, which is showing that Africa's opportunities of green industrialization are actually pretty broad. And they also relate to the fact that the whole margins between different sectors, manufacturing, agriculture, and services, are beginning to blur as technology changes, as we move into the realm of artificial intelligence, for example. Already at the top of value chains is not basic manufacturing, it's things like product design, marketing, branding, all of those kind of issues, as well as the fact that at the other end, something like the industrialization of fresh is important. And I think in all of these areas, there will be everything that we do. There will be a premium on us moving into a lower carbon economy. We may, for a while, be able to just produce goods for sale in our own backyards or in the region if we are, outside of the norms of the low carbon transition. But that won't last for very long. And so I think that we don't have an opportunity to industrialize first and clean up later. We have to do both simultaneously. And I think that that opportunity is lying before us. If we have the courage to take it, if we have the courage to recognize that none of this is going to come automatically, it's going to require, as every other industrialization effort has, the application of industrial policy. Some of that is what Carlos was talking about, the boring issues, but I think also the uncontroversial issues internationally. That, if we just invest in human potential and education and training, if we try to raise standards and stuff, no one's going to object to that. But it does also mean that we have to leverage off the raw material base that we have, set conditions to external partners through a range of possible measures of, conditions attached to supply agreements, ranging to export taxes. The example that David Luke gave about Ghana and other countries raising through collective action, the price of cocoa. All of those things, I think, are going to have to become increasingly part of our international economic diplomacy and so on. So I think that it's a complex journey that we're on. But I think that what is happening now is that there must be a growing recognition And I think there is to some extent a growing recognition that there is no other path available to us. That if we just come through this transition to the low carbon economy in the same position as we've always been, where the supplies of raw materials, and we're content to remain in that position. I think we're going to find that this is a highly unjust transition, given that Africa is disproportionately affected by climate change. As it's no longer something that's happening in the future; it's happening now, and that no one is going to give us money for mitigation unless our economies become more, unless they develop more resources. We're not going to have the resource capability to actually mount significant adaptation efforts, which are going to become critically important for our peoples as we move ahead. So let me stop there. Those, I think, are a few remarks, I think, to build on the direction of travel, which I think the scenarios have prompted us to do, and which the previous speakers have all referred to in one way or another. So.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rob. And I think you've led us very nicely into our next question, because all of this is going to require capital. And right now, the gap between our needs on the continent and international finance flows is vast. So let's turn to the question of domestic resource mobilization, which has been identified in the scenarios work as central to any realistic transition pathway. And now I want to ask you what you consider as the most significant untapped opportunity within domestic capital markets that could be mobilized to close part of the financing gap.
Thank you, Ellen. So I think I'm going to start with a simple point. Africa's long-term in climate and development future is really going to be contingent on its ability to finance its own priorities, right? International climate finance will always matter, but I think we know that it's not going to come at the pace and predictability that we really need. If you're looking at our current finance needs, we're looking at roughly 200 billion US dollars annually needed in order for us to be able to satisfy our climate commitments by 2030. If we look at the data, we're receiving about 50 billion of that, a fraction of what we actually need, right? So the gap is really why domestic resource mobilization is essential. It's not optional for African countries. It's going to be how African countries build fiscal sovereignty. It's going to be how we mitigate or limit our vulnerability to external shocks. And it's really going to be how we take ownership of our development path, right? We keep on talking about locally led development. It seems like a mantra, but it's critical to Africa's path moving forward. But I'd like to also say, I think what's often missed in this conversation is that, and Prof. Carlos alluded to this earlier, is that there already exists a significant amount of capital on the continent. And this can be seen across banks, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and reserves. And if you're looking at actual figures, we're talking about trillions of dollars, about 4 trillion that is available. But the challenge really is, it's not the absence of money. If we were to even take a fraction of the finance that I've just mentioned and channel them into climate resilient infrastructure, into adaptation, regional value chains, I think Africa will be able to close the financing gap in a very meaningful way. But that will mean, getting some basics right? It would mean mobilizing pension and sovereign wealth funds on the continent. It would mean mobilizing domestic private capital. It would mean a very strategic use of blended finance instruments. It would mean strengthened and reformed taxation systems, particularly around multinationals. And it would also mean, we want to move from being an extractive-led economies, but it would mean reinvesting commodity revenues through sovereign wealth funds. And at the same time, tackling critical issues around illicit finance financial flows. But I would like to say that we are seeing some encouraging movement at the country and continental level. You have institutions like Afro-Exim Bank and the Africa Finance Corporation, really stepping forward with local currency lending, with credit enhancements, and the ability for cross-border projects. We also see country investment platforms. We saw a lot of pledges at COP30 and the launch of the country platforms hub. And so we see places like South Africa with the South African JETP, Senegal and Egypt that showcase, really good examples of what's possible when you use frameworks like country investment platforms to make sure there's an alignment with public priorities, domestic private capital, and international resources. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that this finance also reaches the local level. That is fundamental. We want to see it reach SMEs. We want it to reach municipalities and cooperatives, because that is where that's really where you start to see solid ground being developed, right? Local renewable projects, stronger value change, as it was alluded to earlier, and real jobs created. Because at the end of the day, this challenge has a human face. But it ultimately comes down to agency, right? We want to make sure that African governments are mobilizing domestic capital, but that they're also strengthening governance systems, right? Local capability, state capability is critical, and that they're using regional institutions effectively so that we can truly move away from reacting to external conditions and really, truly shaping our own trajectory. I'll stop here, Helen. Thank you.
Thank you, Awa. And as you've said, as Prof said, finance isn't enough. Any transition has to be anchored with the change actually happens in communities. So I want to move to the question of localization, which really sits at the heart of effectiveness and sustainability. Claude, people use the term localization in many different ways. For you, what does localization really mean in practice, and what do we need to put in place to see true localization actually happen?
And thank you so much. Maybe let me start with an anecdote. The title is "The Day the River Changed Its Mind." It's a story that happened in a Philippine village. A river that has always been peaceful for generations suddenly rose up and destroyed everything in its path, houses, crops. Then experts, when they arrived with data and instrument, they could not find a solution to the problem. But the real solutions came from the village women, who drew from centuries of indigenous knowledge to replant mangroves, redesign flood channels, and build a grassroots disaster response network. When the flood returned the next year, not a single home was lost. The crops were intact. When the technician, the expert, asked the mayor what happened, the mayor responded that the river did not change. We finally did. This anecdote reminds us, Ellen, that localization is about shifting power. It's about shifting decision-making and resources closer to the local communities, so that development efforts are led by the people who are directly affected. I would like to switch off my camera. I think I've got a problem with my network. So I was saying, so it's about recognizing the enormous capacity that sits with communities, with local institutions, but also with organized civil society. Also ensuring that they have the mandate, the authority, the finances and the support they need, both in terms of logistics, to drive solutions rooted in local realities. So, lasting climate and development progress in Africa, I think, will come from approaches, just as this anecdote has told us, that are locally led and community anchored and context specific. And we are already seeing on the continent some shifts happening. For example, institutions like the African Union and the African Development Bank are creating frameworks that center African priorities, including the AU's climate finance strategy, which aim to channel more resources through African institutions. But beside that, I think what is also important really at country level, we are also seeing countries taking effort to really localize this shift. In Kenya, for example, county climate change funds are being channeled directly to counties through participatory processes, bringing decisions closer to communities and improving accountability. And there is also the case of Ghana and Senegal, where we are seeing policy making more inclusive, bringing in civil society voices and private sector capacity into national planning. A concrete example of how community really or community members can really support this transition is the case that happened in Zanzibar, where the Zanzibar solar mamas show for around 6 months of solar engineering training, or after 6 months of solar engineering training, which enabled these rural women to electrify over 1,800 homes and become paid technicians and trainers, boosting incomes, skills, and local resilience. This is a clear indication that when you build capacity of communities, they can take charge of their own lives. However, what we've realized across all these localized initiatives, that there is a problem of how do we ensure that fiscal decentralization is effective. But so far what we've seen is that there's quite very limited capacity for fiscal decentralization, also weak local institution, often lacking resources. So the issue of finances and logistics and skilled people, communities, becomes a problem that needs to be resolved. But today, for example, less than 10% of global climate finance only reaches local actors directly, what is very, very low. So what needs really to be done if we are going to ensure that the shift is effective? So the first thing I would like to propose here is that first, national and subnational government must have the authority and the resources to act. Strengthened fiscal decentralization becomes very key. Secondly, is communities need to direct access to climate finance and the ability to design their own solutions, or simplifying funding processes and channeling resources through local institutions. That's critical. Encouraging decentralized renewable energy capacity is also an important one. But thirdly, in more economic localization is essential. Investing in local value chains and linking them to continental market will create jobs, return value, and build resilience. The issue of regional integration becomes critical here because when you produce good, you need to have a market. And I think the market can be found on the continent, considering what David was saying about 1.4 billion people we have on the continent. So localization, finally, Ellen, is ultimately about building a transition that is owned by African people, shaped by their priorities, and sustained by institutions that are close to the ground. I'll leave it there for now, Ellen. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Claude. And you touched on something that Prof. Lopez also mentioned, and that's the importance of institutional capability. Without strong institutions, none of these transitions can be implemented at scale or sustained over time. So, Susie, a question to you is, what do you see as the most important governance capabilities that African countries must strengthen to ensure climate and development strategies translate into consistent, sustained implementation?
Thank you very much, Ellen, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak at this important event today. As you noted in your question, governance is the foundation on which all other process advances and rest. And I think that was already said before me. So it is critical that the scenarios identified this as a key dimension, because unfortunately, often we jump quickly on discussing or designing technical sectorial solutions when we think about climate and development strategies. So to respond to your question, and I think this is a message we consistently heard across Africa's climate and development landscape, we need also to prioritize and build strong, capable, and accountable institutions. Why? Because, and this was already said, and we all know that strong institutions are essential to design solutions that reflect our own realities, to ensure transparency, to maintain continuity across political cycles. We know how critical this is. To turn strategies into executable plans, so we don't as often negotiate, design nice paper and never implement them. And also finally, to create the enabling environment for investment and innovation. And we have seen examples of what strong institutional performance look like on the continent, particularly in terms of revenue mobilization and public finance management. But unfortunately, we have also seen the opposite, where weak institutional systems create inertia or derail even well-designed programs, including and particularly in resource-rich contexts where real benefit for citizens can't materialize because of this weak institutional system. So now, how to get there is the difficult question, and as usual, nobody has the magical solution. But let me share some elements that can help, I believe, shift our thinking and effort into the right direction. And I think that does reflect many of the elements that were shared before me. First, government institutions need to equip themselves with good information and reliable data, including a good understanding or a robust understanding of our own political and social dynamics, so we can design the right policies and avoid costly or ill-suited policies, particularly those imported model that was also referred before. Secondly, and this is very important, government also need to build strong coordination mechanism. On the one hand, across government institutions, because unfortunately, we have seen that many times ministry not talking together, particularly when implementing some cross-cutting issues. And this is important to ensure internal coherence vision. But also this coordination mechanism has to also happen between the governments and other key stakeholders, since government cannot and should not deliver this transition alone. And what are those key stakeholders that can play a very important and complementary role here is civil society and union to help ensure equitability and connect reforms to citizen needs. I think that was also mentioned in the context of localization. We also need to work with universities and think tanks, because they are well placed to generate the evidence and data and support policy design. And having clear connection between government policy design and these stakeholders is important. The private sector, of course, ultimately, this is a very key stakeholder that can bring the innovation capacity we need and investment. I think also regional bodies, making the link to what David said earlier, is very important, because we need to align also the national choices with the continental priorities. thinking about the AFCFTA, the African Union Climate Agenda. And last but not least, we often forget one stakeholders, media. I think it's also very important to include them in the discussion because at least they are important to change the narrative, even about how we speak about Africa, on Africa, from Africa. So at some point we see, if I can say that, the glass as half full rather than half empty. Well, now how to translate that into practice? There are many things that can be done, but clearly from the ACF scenario planning processes, there are 4 main entry point I would like to share with you today. The first one is to strengthen core government capabilities, including on data system, digital governance tool, and public financial management. The second one is to ground the reforms in local realities and recognize that effective institutions reflect each country's history, governance culture, and social context. So again, this is something very important to ensure we own the kind of institution we are building and using for advancing Africa. We also need, third, to create and invest in balanced governance ecosystem that provide, if I can say, a real space for Africa's vibrant civic actors, civil society, union, universities, think tank, etc. Because unfortunately, often there is a kind of lack of trust, or the starting point is like not very cooperative, but confrontational. So we need also to be innovative to create this space. And finally, we also need to support peer learning and cooperation across countries, regions, civic network on what kind of institution works, what kind of institution are adapted to our realities and can be scaling up in different contexts. So to conclude, I do believe when government and civic actors work together, when reforms reflect local realities, and when decisions are guided by evidence, institutions become powerful enablers for Africa's long-term resilience and prosperity. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susie. So we had a bunch of other questions that we were going to pose to the panel, but we've quickly run out of time, and we really do want to have a conversation with a broader group. So with that, I would like to thank the panel immensely for their support throughout the process, for participating today. And I'll hand over to Tim, who's going to lead us into the plenary discussion.
Thanks so much, Ellen, and thanks all of you for being here today. It's been exciting to see that we've had more than 100 people joining us live today, and many more hopefully will watch this once it's posted to YouTube tomorrow. But there's a number of questions that have come in the chat that I'd love to pose maybe for the panelists, but also this is an opportunity to create space for others to share comments. So if you are interested to come into the conversation, and either reflect on the kind of priority pathways that you've heard about today, or share additional thoughts on what it'll take to make progress over the next 5 years, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll try and weave you into the conversation here. One of the first questions that came in picked up on what Professor Lopez has talked about leapfrogging. And this question looked at where do you see the strongest opportunities for African countries to leapfrog with technologies in renewables, digital agritech, coastal resilience, et cetera? And what would it take to do that in terms of policy or financing priorities? And so I wanted to just see if any of the panelists have some quick thoughts on kind of that opportunity on the leapfrogging side, to dig a little bit deeper to that. And also anybody on the webinar, feel free to chat in your comments on this question too, if you have particular thoughts. But just want to see, I don't know, Rob, you were touching on the regional supply chains. Any thoughts you have on leapfrogging, and then can see if any of the other panelists want to come in?
Well, I think that we have to take account of enormous technological changes which are ongoing, and the most important of those is artificial intelligence. And I don't know what I would say immediately are the opportunities for us to leapfrog in that direction. But I do think that one of the advantages that we do have, which is that we do not have as much embedded capital that is, basically tied up in high carbon technologies and processes. And I think there's a range of opportunities in all kinds of sectors, including, for example, textile production, smart agriculture, and things like that. Where if we adopt more low carbon and less damaging environmental techniques, we have an opportunity to perhaps move more quickly than other countries which have got to deal with what they're going to do about the embedded technologies that they've got in those sectors.
Thanks, Rob. And that's a great point about less stranded assets and then leveraging internet, um, satellite internet access, and a range of other new technologies coming online, AI. Any of the other panelists have thoughts you want to share on leapfrogging and where you see near-term opportunities? Claude?
Yes, I think just to add on the strong point made by Rob, my sense, I think we are seeing some hubs of technological hubs happening on the continent. We've got capacity in South Africa, in Morocco, in Egypt. My sense is that for us to leapfrog, we need these countries with some of this technological hub to work together. I think we are coming back to the question of Africa coming together. And my sense is that we are seeing some level timid innovation from these countries. My sense is that unless these countries come together to speed up the process, we might not leapfrog as fast as we would like, but only by coming together. And we've got these apps that are happening across the continent that we need to bring together, share knowledge and innovation for us to catch up. Thank you.
Thanks, Claude. David, I wanted to ask you a question that came in from one of our audience members around during the scenario development process that I know you were intimately involved in. What challenges were identified regarding Africa's collaboration and ability to negotiate as one powerful voice? And what potential entry points or levers could help reverse this fragmentation?
That's a great question, Tim. I think first let's look back, and here we know that the AFCFTA, for example, was negotiated within 3 years. That was a record that happened so very quickly and caught so many people by surprise. So it's clear that these sorts of challenges of working together to achieve concrete outcomes could be achieved. I also mentioned the case of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana on cocoa prices. I think that we do need to have our hegemons, the big economies. I think that's the entry point. The big economies driving this process, and I think we're getting there. I think we're seeing the leadership of South Africa, for example, on the G20 and the prioritization of some critical issues that they put on the table on finance, on debt, and so on. And then a commitment that this leadership will continue beyond the presidency of the G20 to look at other issues where they could exercise leadership to drive the agenda forward. So I think the basis is there. I don't want to talk about political will and all that because we talk about that all the time. But I think that looking at these concrete examples tell us that it is possible and that these are some of the entry points that we should be looking at.
Thanks so much, David. One thing that's came up a couple times during the process was about the value and power of platforms that bring together different actors across the continent. And I know philanthropy and African Climate Foundation have been very active in trying to kind of support some of those and also think about creative ways for technical assistance that and capacity building that really kind of strengthen relationships across countries. And I'm just curious if that triggers any thoughts or anything that you want to highlight. I know Salim and Ellen, you've been very close to a lot of this work, but any other thoughts on kind of what it will take to kind of really strengthen cooperation, collaboration, and partnership across the continent? Susie?
Sorry, I think you asked a question to Eileen and Celine. I don't know
That's
if you want.
fine. Yeah, go for it.
Now, just to complement on this need of coordination and coherence. Maybe I will go back to some basics, but I think it's really important to remind that, particularly I have seen that in the context of the ICFTA negotiation, the protocol on investment, being able for each country first at national level to put in place this coordination mechanism is so critical. And sometimes it seems obvious, but when you have in the negotiation one day one negotiator and the next month someone else that can have no clue about what you have discussing, that's really not helping. And when the government that was able to have a coherent position, well coordinated and organized position, were the one that was able to advance and really get the most of a discussion. And that shows something that is possible and we should use as a model moving forward, not only when we are negotiating among ourselves as in the ICFTA, but I think even more critically when we organize ourselves to negotiate, because we said we need Africa to speak as one voice. So being able to have this coordination mechanism at national level will make it easier then to scale up at regional with the RECs and then at continental level to be able to speak in one voice. So I just wanted to compliment that this is something very critical indeed moving forward. But it's definitely doable. The mechanism exists, the system exists, and with the right support, we can put them, we can implement them.
Thanks, Susie. Any other thoughts people want to share on the panel here around what it will take on the kind of cooperation, regional integration side?
Maybe if I can just add a few things that that we are seeing. The one is that we have the Africa Group of Negotiators, which we support, and that is a interesting group that I feel has a huge has existed for a long time. Works with a number of governments across the region. In fact, it seems to be going from strength to strength. The second is that Rob is involved in the Green Industrial Development Experts Panel, which is a way of coordinating a number of African experts across the region to provide a regional approach to this, and but also to then be able to home in specific countries where expertise and advice is needed. There's the Africa Experts Panel, which will have another continuity after G20. I think there are a lots of, I would say, interesting regional coordination mechanisms evolving that don't only depend on sort of what I would say statutory, statutory treaties or legal instruments for these coordination mechanisms to exist. There, a lot of them also involve non-state actors, and that's very encouraging to see. Yeah, but Rob and Carlos and many others have a lot more experience on this. Maybe they want to add. Thanks.
Thanks, Salim. Rob? Oh, looks like you're on mute.
Yeah,
There you go.
yeah. I just wanted to say that I think that one of the differences between the development integration paradigm that I was referring to, and trade integration, is that cooperation, coordination only emerges very late in an integration process after lots more formal trade integration processes like customs unions and things like that. And I think that what's staring us in the face is that we need to seek to implement those much earlier in our integration process. But also, since it is at a relatively early stage of our integration process, we're not talking directive planning where the African Union or the AFCFTA is going to tell country X how to conduct its industrial policy or whatever. It's going to be a series of coordinating actions that are going to take place through national government mechanisms, but where the benefits of working together are realized, where the building of a regional value chain is realized, where the search for inclusivity to bring in the smaller economies is realized. I think that is the way forward. And that, incidentally, is what ASEAN is doing to great success in East Asia. So I think that's the process that we need to embark on. That doesn't mean that there are no common messages at the continental level. I think there are, desperately need to be. And I think those would include that Africa is no longer content to be the supplier of raw materials to the rest of the world. It will now be seeking to leverage off its mineral base to promote value addition, that the way that external partners are going to benefit from the continental free trade area is not by offloading finished goods or hoping that we're going to suddenly liberalize towards them, but rather by what we call investment-led trade, that they will come in, they will establish a plant, they will produce, and they will qualify under the rules of origin and benefit from the CFTA in that way. So I think there's a lot of external diplomacy where I think high-level all-continent action takes place, and then there are different levels of cooperation and coordination around the actual nitty-gritties of industrial policy to move forward in that way.
Thanks, Rob. Salim?
I also wanted to invite Carlos because he was also a special envoy, and for the COP30, and there's also been a level of coordination that I think we see emerging, at least on the discourse around the Africa Climate Summit. So we've had two of them, and there's a third one coming. But I want to distinguish between the state of play in terms of soft power coordination, which the Africa Group of Negotiators, in one respect, represents that, versus hard power and the ability to influence what happens in the real economy. And I think those two are not on the same plane at the moment. So that's where a lot more work needs to be done. And so you need institutions like the AFDB, the Africa Exim Bank, the AU, and others to be able to coordinate that at a level where you can see that coordination translated into a set of negotiations and outcomes that benefit countries in a more direct way. So that distinction between soft power coordination versus hard power is really what, in my mind, they exist at different levels of state of play. Thanks.
Thanks, Salim. Professor Lopez, any thoughts you want to share? Feel free to come in. There's also two other topic areas that I see in the Q&A section here. One is kind of around the localization and subnational level, and how do we really drive progress, ensure, the ability to make projects and investments bankable and, lower risk at the community level. How do we think about policy and technology transfer approaches at that subnational level to really enable localization to come through? And the other question that I see writing this is thinking about trade-offs between kind of social agenda, and as climate impacts intensify and have more impact on people, how do we balance that with really investment in some of these green industrialization and transition approaches? And is it really a fixed game some there in terms of trade-offs between social and transition investments? And how do we think about navigating that, equipping finance ministers to balance those competing pressures? So those are two themes I see in the Q&A here, and just wanted to open that and see if any of the panelists have thoughts on either that you'd like to share, and also feel free to chat in anything to participants as well. Awa?
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, I was quite I thought this was the question around competing priorities is a really important one. As a former Ministry of Finance official myself, I think I can appreciate the pressure that finance ministers are under on a daily basis in terms of addressing competing priorities around how to deploy a very, very sacred and very limited public funding. But I do think there's a lot more work that can be done in order to shift the narrative and thinking around climate action and why it should be prioritized. I think it shouldn't be seen as an add-on or as an additional cost, but something that is reinforcing or complementary to the development goals of countries, right? So for me, climate risks are fiscal risks. They're going to come back to bear on the very fiscus you're trying to protect. So if you don't address climate-related issues, they're going to erode the very social, the sector issues that you're trying or whose investment you're trying to protect, right? If floods erode school infrastructure, if climate-related diseases drive up the health budget, and so forth, all of those issues actually increase vulnerability and inequality and ultimately suffering in our country. So I think it's not about diverting resources from social sectors into climate, but how do we mainstream climate issues into our fiscal frameworks, right? Climate smart health systems, resilient education infrastructure, adaptive protection, so that the investments that we are making are taking into account those sustainability considerations so that we can protect the future of the African citizenry tomorrow. So I think it's a narrative shift that needs to happen, and climate issues are not separate from developmental or social issues.
Thanks, Al. I think we've got about 2 more minutes before I hand it back to Ellen. So maybe quickly take comments from Rob and from David.
Yeah, I would say I don't see this as a dichotomy. I think that really what's going to happen is we need to recognize that climate damage to social infrastructure can also be climate damage to economic infrastructure as well. So the example in KwaZulu-Natal was people's houses were damaged, but so was the Toyota plant in floods recently. So I think it's not a question of one or the other. I think rather that we need to see that the industrialization process is going to be the process that is going to release or create the resources we're going to need for more and more ambitious adaptation programs, because no one's going to give it to us from the outside. I think as we're learning, there's huge underfunding of anything called adaptation from the outside. What I would want to say is that I think that this is going to require that we break from the idea. Most of the fiscal issues are ratios, and it's something over GDP that has to be within bounds. And we never think that that can happen by raising the GDP. It's always got to be that we cut the expenditure, which also then has a contractionary effect on economies. So I think it is also breaking out of the straitjacket of externally imposed fiscal models and approaches to fiscal monetary policy and economic governance that I think are really leading us nowhere.
Thanks, Rob. We've got time for one last comment from David. Claudia,
Yes.
I'd invite you to, if you could chat in whatever
Yeah.
you wanted to
And,
make, that'd be
and I'll
great.
be brief because I think both Hawa and Rob have addressed the issue. But just to point to one concrete case that I'm looking at, which is Morocco, where uh, all these things are being done simultaneously. They've not got everything perfectly right, but what we're beginning to see from the Morocco example is how social policies, economic policies, industrial policies are all coming together in an interesting way to deliver some results. So I know we don't have much time and I cannot elaborate, but look carefully at the Morocco case.
Thanks. And I'll just highlight there's some other great questions in there about private sector engagement and things that I think can inform the conversations as they go on. But with that, I'd like to thank you all and to turn back to Ellen Davies to close us out.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm sorry to have cut this conversation short. I think just very, very rich discussion. So I wanted to end just with a reflection from ACF. I think for us, the scenarios journey has been an extraordinary learning experience. We didn't just produce a report, we engaged in a process that really challenged us, stretched our thinking, and helped us deepen our understanding of what it will take Africa to navigate in an increasingly complex world. And what's become clear for us is that these conversations can't end here. The scenarios work is only the beginning. At ACF, as we have for the past 5.5 years. We're going to continue to convene and to question and to imagine, and we're very committed to partnering with everyone who's working to ensure Africa realizes its full potential. We've also learned a great deal from the process itself. So for those of you that are interested in how we designed and facilitated the scenarios work, we'd be very, very happy to continue the conversation. Before we wrap up, I just really want to extend our thank you to the fantastic panel, to our chair, Professor Lopez, for his leadership and wisdom, and to all of you for your engagement throughout the session. For those of you that are heading into the end of year break, we wish you a wonderful, restful, joyful holiday period. And thank you again for being part of this conversation. And we really look forward to continuing the journey with all of you in the new year. Thank you all, and have a wonderful evening, day, further.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye bye.